Austrian Economics, and that's extremely broad. But what I'd like to do is to come back and revisit an aspect of neoclassical economics that had been criticized by, and I think demolished, by Murray Rothbard in a number of papers that he'd written in the 50s and 60s, one of which was Value Implications of Economic Theory. The other was his great article on Towards the Reconstruction of Utility and Welfare Economics. In those articles, he pointed out that neoclassical economists smuggled in implicit judgments of value, okay, in attempting to assess if a certain change, via government policy or otherwise, brought about an improvement in economic welfare or a reduction in economic welfare. And Rothbard's point was that you could not make this judgment without bringing in some kind of ethical presupposition. What I want to do is to look at two modern neoclassical economists who are very good writers, who have written two books that are accessible to the layperson, and from which the layperson can learn quite a bit. One is by David Friedman, and it's called Hidden Order, The Economics of Everyday Life. The other is by Stephen E. Landsberg, The Armchair Economist, Economics and Everyday Life. Okay, notice the everyday life. The ethics that they come up with via economics is the furthest thing you can imagine, as I'll show you, from everyday life. In fact, I'm writing an article on this called The Ethics of Everyday Economists. In any case, as I said, the books are good. I mean, I recommend that you read them. They're entertaining, and you can learn from them. But what I want to show you is that they have smuggled in certain assumptions, okay, based on a fallacious approach to economic theory. They've either smuggled in ethical assumptions or, despite their denial, they have assumed interpersonal comparisons of utility, okay, something that cannot be done in economics. Okay, let's start with David Friedman. Landsberg is much smarter than Friedman. Friedman just chugs along in sort of the Marshallian framework that his father had reconstructed, and that other Chicago economists had reconstructed, and draws some implications for welfare economics in his book. And basically what he wants to do is he really wants to substitute efficiency for ethics. Okay? Let me just read to you a statement in a chapter that is revealingly entitled Summing People Up. Okay. He says, they keep coming to us, we everyday economists, with questions. Should we have a tariff? Should we have rent control? We answer, should? Economists don't know anything about should. Go talk to a philosopher like Roderick Long. No, he doesn't say that. If you have a tariff, such and such will happen. If you have rent control, and so on. In other words, all economists can do is to make positive statement about the consequences of these various policies. And he goes on. No, they say. We don't want to know all that. Is it good or bad? Okay, so now he's claiming the economist is really pushed into making judgments or coming up with some way of making judgments. So he goes on to say, the economist finally answers as follows. I have no expertise in good and bad. I can, however, define something called efficiency that has the following characteristics. First, it is an important part of what I suspect most of you mean by good. Second, economics helps answer the question of whether a change leads to greater efficiency. Okay. Third, I cannot think of any alternative measure closer, okay, notice the word measure, closer to what you want that also has a second characteristic, okay, which is whether a change leads to greater efficiency. Okay. First of all, there can be no ethics, quantitative ethics, as Murray Rothbard repeatedly pointed out. Okay, no philosopher, no ethical theorist in history has come up with a way of measuring any sort of along any sort of ethical dimension. Okay, but that aside, Friedman basically is arguing here that the criterion of efficiency gives less than adequate answers, okay, to should questions, but that the answers it gives is substantially better than no answers at all, or answers that are given without the use of economics. So in effect, he's saying that we could do worse than to answer the question by using efficiency. Now, he says that there's two drawbacks of using efficiency as the ethics, or as the criterion for good or bad, whether a tariff is good or bad, or whether rent control is good or bad. And he admits, he says, first of all, we are accepting each person's evaluation of how much something is worth to him. Okay? The value of heroin to an addict has some status, has the same status as the value of insulin to a diabetic. Okay, so we're not making those sort of ethical distinctions between different goods. And secondly, he says, there's also the drawback that by using money as a unit of comparison, we are ignoring differences in utility of money to different people. Okay, so for example, if a change injured a poor man by $9 but benefited a millionaire by $10, you would suspect in some meaningful sense, and I'm talking as Friedman, this is Friedman, that $10 was worth less to the millionaire than $9 to the poor man. Well, that's completely said without any basis whatsoever. Okay, you don't know if the millionaire is a miser that fondles his $9 every night, or his $10 every night. I mean, there's no way of knowing that. It's absurd. Okay, there is, when you say there's no unit of satisfaction, it means that there is no unit like foot or pounds that is invariable and that is the same for every individual. Okay, satisfaction is an intensive magnitude, as Mises stresses. There is no way to compare satisfaction from the same good between two people, and not only that, between two people at different, the same person at different times. Okay, so Friedman's response to these drawbacks is, well, economic improvement is intended, okay, this idea of economic improvement judged by efficiency, is intended as a workable approximation of our intuition. So now he's appealing to intuition and not to reason. Okay, the hallmark of economics, okay, as a science is the fact that you engage in rational analysis, okay, not that you appeal to your intuition. By the way, he gets this idea of intuition from his father, who in turn gets it from Frank Knight. Okay, Frank Knight is almost as evil as Keynes in the development of the history of at least American economics. Okay, a lot of the error that we see in, and I'm using the word evil in sort of in a jocular sense, but in any case, most of the errors that we see in modern micro-theory in particular come from Frank Knight, particularly perfect competition theory. So he says that, again, it's intended as a workable approximation of our intuitions about what changes on net good or bad. So, in other words, he defines it, or he says that directly adding up happiness instead of using dollars as a proxy would be better, but there is no such unit. So what he's saying is that, all right, he's agreeing that you can't find a unit for happiness or satisfaction, but we're going to use dollars as a proxy, despite the fact that he's just admitted that the utility of dollars to different people are very different. Okay. Now, how do we add up different people's utilities? Okay, in order to decide if if a change involves a net gain to society or a net loss to society? Okay. Well, what he wants to show is that the gain to one person is enough to compensate a loss to another, or he says that's one way of doing it. Okay. So we use the concepts of consumer surplus and consumer and producer surplus. Let me just give you a quick example. And I'm sure if you've had intermediate or possibly even basic microeconomics, you know, you're familiar with the concept of consumer surplus and producer surplus. But let me just give you this example. Let's say that you have consumers A, B, C, D, and E. Okay. So these are the consumers here. And we have the price of the good, or I'm sorry, we have their maximum buying price for the good. That's the maximum price that they'll pay for, let's say, a can of Coke per day. And we have the price that is actually determined on the market. So let's start with A. A is a Coke fanatic, and you know, would pay up to $10 for a can of Coke, and B 5, C 4, 3, D $3, these are in dollars, and E $1.50. And that the price for everyone is $1. Okay. Well then, according to Friedman, A gets $9 of consumer surplus, and since dollars dollars are a proxy for satisfaction, he gets somehow $9 worth of satisfaction, and B4 and C3, D2, and 50 cents for E. Okay. And you can add all of this up, and you'll come out with some overall figure, which we get as $18.50 of satisfaction from Coke. And then we have producers, and the producers are, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, their marginal cost, the cost at which they can produce the additional Coke, or this can of Coke, is starts at 40 cents and then 50, okay, 60 cents. So the less efficient producers have higher marginal costs, and 95 cents. Well then somehow, again, if all the prices are the same, it's $1 all the way through here, then you have the producer 1 realizing 60 cents of producer surplus. That is dollars and cents of satisfaction that he gets from selling the Coke and receiving the money. And so 50 cents from $1 here is 50 cents, and so on. Okay, so we have 40, 25, and a nickel. Okay. And if you add all that up, you get producer surplus equal to $1.70, and we add these two things up. So this is the consumer surplus C, producer surplus. We get $20.20. So exchange has generated, according to Friedman, $20.20 of net gain to society. Okay? Now, this method was more or less originated by Alfred Marshall, and it makes some heroic assumptions, and Friedman admits this. It assumes that everyone gets the same utility from $1, because this allows us to answer the question, is a change in economic improvement? So certainly exchange in this framework is an economic improvement. People have realized $20.20 of additional satisfaction. Okay. Secondly, but everyone obviously does not get the same utility from $1. Okay, the rich man, poor man problem. What is Friedman and Marshall's answer to that? Well, they say individual differences cancel out when analysis changes, when analyzing changes such as tariffs that affect large, diverse groups of people. Okay, now what does that mean? Individual changes cancel out. Okay, it's ridiculous. On the one hand, the average height of somebody in this room could be 5'10", but no one in the room, you could have a lot of people that are 5'2", and many people are 6'8", and no one is 5'10". Okay, so in other words, they may average out in some aggregate sense or ex post sense after the fact, okay, but still each individual is different. It still doesn't change things. It doesn't change the fact that because A would pay up to $10, okay, and B only up to $5, that somehow A enjoys a Coke twice as much as B does, okay, or D enjoys Coke twice as much. It's ridiculous, okay. All we know is what we see, what is demonstrated by the individual making the purchase, that this individual enjoys the Coke more than the $1. And even if we could know that he would really legitimately pay $10, and you can't know by asking him, it's still because money itself is a good that's exchanged on the market. It's not a yardstick. It's just a good in which you have prices expressed. It doesn't measure anything. Money is not a measure. Its own value is changing over time as prices go up and down. Okay? So money is just another good like Coke. Why pick out money and say that it measures satisfaction? It really doesn't. Okay? Just like Coke, it has different levels of satisfaction, or just like Coke, the satisfaction between different people for money cannot be compared, measured, and so on, or summed up. Okay? So their argument, though, is that if you talk about the producers and consumers of steel, if you take a tariff off, yes, the producers are hurt, but the consumers are benefited. Okay, and since you have so many consumers, and a very few producers, that is, maybe the workers in the steel industry are hurt and the stockholders. Their answer is that, yes, there is a definite net improvement. Okay, our intuition tells us so. Okay, all these differences between people and the value they attach to money somehow cancel out. But there is no scientific argumentation here. Okay. What's the Austrian response? Well, the Austrian response to all this is that the marginal utility of money cannot be compared between people, okay? Because utility is simply a subjective ranking. Really what's happening here is that nothing's being measured. What we have is that A prefers $10 to $9 to, or prefers a Coke to $10, okay? And which he prefers to $9 and so on all the way down to $1. And maybe his second Coke, because of the law of marginal utility, he wouldn't pay $1 for, he'd pay no more than 75 cents. And third Coke, he might pay no more than 25 cents, the third Coke a day, okay? So it's just a ranking, okay, without any measurability. There's no measurement involved here. It's purely ordinal. Okay, so that's the Austrian response to this. And certainly you cannot, as I mentioned, compare the value of the Coke between A and E, even though A would pay a higher price. Well, maybe money has lower value or something to that person. But there is no fixed unit that has an extension in space, okay, like a foot, an inch, a pound, that can be used in which to state the direct satisfaction of A and E, okay? In fact, it's completely meaningless. It's like saying that I saw a square circle today, okay, or that I saw a house that was red and green all over at the same time. It's meaningless as that statement to say that someone values a good more than someone else, based on the fact that that person is willing to pay a higher price for it. You can say they're willing to pay a higher market value, okay, or for a price for it, but subjectively, you cannot make that comparison. Okay, it's meaningless. Not only it's wrong, it's just a meaningless statement existentially. Okay. In fact, in the 1930s, when it was shown that value was the result of an ordinal ranking of goods on a person's value scale, the great Austrian economist Lionel Robbins said, think of it in these terms, that value is like love. Okay, you can love let's say a male can love one woman more than another, and he can demonstrate that greater love by marrying that person. Okay, you could date a number of women and he marries one. Okay, so what is he doing? He's ranking one more than the other. He cannot say I love her 3 times as much as I love her. Okay, it would make absolutely no sense. Well, the same thing is true in the case of interpersonal comparisons. Okay, not only that. A single individual can't even measure utility himself. In other words, a couple of years ago, and I may have mentioned this in an earlier lecture, I went to see Paul McCartney play at the Garden for $125 a ticket. Okay, it was my birthday, so my wife splurged. And then I saw Rod Stewart play for $75. Okay, and let's assume that that's right on the margin of how much I would pay for those guys. So let's assume that that's my maximum price. So now, does that mean that since this price is 60% more than this price, or 67% more than this price, that I value this 1.6, I value a McCartney concert 1.67 times what I valued Rod Stewart's concert? That's totally ridiculous. Okay? So even I can't measure the value that I impute to different goods. I can just compare them. Okay? So basically, if I'm buying the tickets at the same time, I'm ranking McCartney here, then $125. Okay, it's the pure rank. I prefer the McCartney concert to $125 to $120. Going down the list, then Rod Stewart, I pay up to $75, and then so on. It's just a ranking. Okay. What confuses us, what confuses economists, is the fact that money itself is subject to arithmetic operations. Okay, that's not being denied. But it's when you say that money somehow reflects the value, okay, or is equal to the value of what you could purchase with it, in that you make this mistake. Yeah.
I'm a little confused as to why you can't say that. Just, I mean, because in this circuit.
Because I said so. No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Obviously, you can't hear very people.
Yeah.
In this case, money. We're talking about one instance. We're not talking about today and tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, the value of money is the same to you.
Yes.
In both cases. So
right.
If I'm willing to pay, I don't know, $20 for a hamburger and $10 for a glass of wine, does that not mean that I value the hamburger twice in that one instance?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that, because because you can even say that you value $70 twice as much as $35, because of the law of diminishing utility, of diminishing marginal utility. Okay. In other words, $100 isn't. Let's say there's $50 and there's $100. $100 doesn't have twice the value as $50, right? Because $50 is allocated to your most the highest valued wants, and then the next $50 to your second set of wants. Okay. Right. And plus there's no unit of value. Okay. This is not a unit of value. Okay. It's the meter of exchange in which all prices are expressed. If the economy was a barter economy, people wouldn't make that mistake. But because money's exchanged on every single market by definition, somehow people think that, well, it's a measure of value, but it's not a measure. Okay? Okay. Now, let me just say something about, Friedman goes on and talks about Marshall and money and reveal preference. He says, there are misinterpretations of the ideas of economic improvement that must be avoided. He says, net benefits do not consist of dollars, but are measured in dollars. Okay? He says that life, wisdom, health, all have value as long as someone is willing to give up dollars for them. Okay? So in other words, he's trying to use it as a proxy, but he's still wrong. He also does point out we cannot ascertain what economic improvement is by asking a person how much he has gained or lost, because people can lie about it. You're really not. They're not in a choice situation when you ask them, so their answers do not have the same veracity or the same truth status as would the answer that they give you implicitly by buying a McCartney ticket for $125. I could say, there's an old joke that an economist sees two economists are walking down the street, and the BMW goes around the corner, and one economist says, "I love that car," and the other one says, "No, you don't," because he would have purchased it if he loved it. He would already have it. Okay. So demonstrated or revealed preference, demonstrated in Austrian terms, is the only way to at least know a part of a person's ranking. So if I do go buy the BMW, then I do rank the BMW more than the, let's say it's a $60,000 model, $60,000 I pay for it, okay? Or anything else I could purchase for the $60,000 at that period in time, okay? So just to sum this up sort of in a diagram, which you probably have all seen already, in the case of, let's say, Coca-Cola, some other individual product, you have a demand curve and a supply curve. Demand for Coke. Then there's a marginal cost curve, the cost of producing additional units of the Coke. And let's say in a given week, there are 19 million cans of Coca-Cola bought and sold, and this is the price, and the equilibrium price is $1. And that's, there's this one guy who, would pay, $20 for a Coke, so that person is way up here at $20, and there's, and he may be represented many times in this demand curve. He might be, David Gordon used to, drink a lot of Coke, so he might be like 15 times, on a weekly or daily basis drinking Coke. Okay, but each one, of course, has a lower value, so he's lower and lower as additional units are purchased. But in any case, the last person to purchase a Coke just values a Coke at $1 according to this analysis. So this is the consumer surplus. Anyone who pays $1 for the Coke, for these 19 million Cokes during the week, values it at a dollar amount that exceeds the $1 price. Okay. So according to the Marshall-Friedman framework, you can sum up this area, or you can compute this area, and that is your consumer surplus. Okay. And there's also producer surplus, which is the area under the price line but above the marginal cost line, and so that the producers that produce up to 19 million are those that in fact realize a surplus of dollars over the dollars they spend on the inputs, and that gives you an idea of their producer surplus. So to get together, that is the net gain in society from the production and sale of Coca-Cola. Okay, so it can be added up. Okay. Whereas the Austrian critique, of course, is, first of all, no one ever knows the shape of demand curves. All we know is that in a given week, we know this point. Okay, that is, we know the price, $1. Okay, and that takes a lot of heroic assumptions to know what the price is, throughout a given market, over a given period of time. Because there's always qualitative differences in the delivery of the services, whether you're getting it out of a Coke machine or getting it from a deli, and there are non-pecuniary benefits from interacting with the deli owner. You have to, on the other hand, you have to walk farther to the deli and so on. So all you know is that 19 million Cokes have been sold in a week. We don't know what the, and there's no way of finding out, this is completely subjective, what the shapes of these curves are, okay? Especially the demand curve. The demand curve could be very steep, could be very flat. If it's very flat, consumer surplus is less. If it's very steep, it's much greater, okay? And there are also problems with assessing supply curves, because they're not based on physical money costs, they're based on opportunity costs, which are also what we might call subjective, okay? So, if you don't know the shapes of the curves, in principle, you don't, and you can never find them out, okay? You can never figure out what the producer and consumer surpluses are. And also, trying to figure out a statistical demand curve from past data. Okay, you have a few points here, 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 here. Okay, so over the past 5 years, okay, or past 5 weeks, okay, these have been the prices and quantities of Coke. Okay, you can't connect these. Okay, this is week 1, week 2. Let's say this is week T minus 5, 5 weeks ago. Week T minus 4, 4 weeks ago. T minus 3, T minus 2, and T minus 1. These are all weeks. You can't connect these and say, oh, we have a demand curve, okay? This is what's called an identification problem, okay? What could have been happening is that, I'm going to use a different color here, supply and demand has been shifting each week. Okay, that way, this way, and that way. Because supply and demand determine price at any given point in time, and they're continually shifting over time. So you do not know if these points lie along the same demand curve. I mean, you do not know if supply has shifted out these weeks, these 5 weeks, and demand has remained the same, in which case they would lie along the same demand curve. Okay, highly unlikely that would happen. But those are just technical objections to the whole thing. The fundamental objection is, the Austrian objection is, even given all of these, setting aside all of these problems, assuming you know what the shapes are, it's still meaningless to aggregate the excess of the maximum buying price of all consumers over the price they pay and call that excess consumer surplus. Okay? Because those dollars are not interchangeable. Okay? The value of those dollars differ between the different people that have purchased the Cokes. Okay, so that's a technical prelude to what now, to this whole idea of efficiency as an ethical criterion. Now let's talk, he gets more into the ethical aspects of it. He says, he finally is ready to define efficiency. He defines efficiency as a situation, he says a situation is efficient if all possible improvements have already been made so that no possible improvements are possible. Okay? So then he tells us what a possible change is. He says a possible change is one that can be made using presently given state of technology, consumer value scales, and available inputs. In other words, at this moment, with the various data of the economic system, if some people can be made better off while others are not made worse off, or if the excess of those who are made better off, the gain, outweighs the costs, or the losses in dollar terms, then there's been a net improvement. And he introduces the concept of what he calls a bureaucrat God to explain this. And he says the following. He says, I find it useful to embody this point in a construct I call a bureaucrat God. A bureaucrat God has all of the knowledge and power that anyone in society has. He knows everyone's preferences and production functions and has unlimited power to tell people what to do. He does not have the power to make gold out of lead or to produce new inventions. He's benevolent. His sole aim is to maximize efficiency in Marshall sense, to make all possible Marshal improvements. Think of him as a three-way cross between Joseph Stalin, Mother Teresa, and the latest craze supercomputer. Okay? So if something sounds crazy, it usually is crazy. Okay? Now, he then goes on to say, an economic arrangement is efficient if it cannot be improved by a bureaucrat God. The reason we care whether an arrangement is efficient is that if it is, there is no point in trying to use economics to improve it. Okay? If it is not efficient, there still may be no way we can improve it, since no bureaucrat gods are available, but it is at least worth looking at. Okay? So, basically, what he's telling us is that this an arrangement is not efficient if it cannot be improved by his bureaucrat God. Okay? He's not saying that he wants a bureaucrat God in society. You have to be very careful. What he is saying is that he's using that standard, that really unrealizable standard, as a standard to judge the efficiency of the market economy. Well, that's absurd, to use a standard that never conceivably could exist in the real world to judge various situations in the real world. Okay? You want to use an achievable standard. I mean, that's the whole point of Austrian economics. Okay? In Austrian economics, the market economy is efficient because it allows entrepreneurs to use prices to calculate their costs and benefits in monetary terms, and to act in a way that moves resources from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. So the profit and loss system allows that. And in that sense, Mises says that prices, as they exist on the market, are perfectly adequate. That does not mean that entrepreneurs don't make mistakes, but those are mistakes that everyone would make, including socialist planners, because those are mistakes that result from uncertainty. That is, the recent decision by 27,000 people were just laid off now. I can't remember the company that's laying them off. GM? Yeah, by GM, absolutely. Right. So they made a mistake in forecasting the demand for their automobiles, okay? And as a result, they're paying for it. But the point is they know what they've done wrong, and they can begin, at least based on what has happened, to change their future plans, right? Whereas that's impossible, by the way, in a socialist society where there's no monetary calculation. So in that sense, the Austrians would say the market economy is efficient in a way that no other economic arrangement can be efficient. That it allows the quantification and comparison of costs and benefits in a way that leads to the social division of labor. Okay? You don't need any bureaucrat card or anything like that to tell you when there's a problem with the system. Because if the government interferes, it distorts monetary calculation. It distorts this very attainable ideal. Okay? So if you have a rent control, that is inefficient in a real sense. In a sense that if you didn't have that rent control, entrepreneurs would make better use of those resources than they're permitted to make. Or if you didn't have a tariff, you would have a better allocation of resources, okay, in a real world sense. All right, so he then goes on and talks about Pareto efficiency, which he disagrees with. And though that it is the efficiency standard that most economists will hold to. And it's just interesting to see some of his criticisms of it, briefly. Pareto efficiency. Okay, so he's upholding Marshal efficiency as opposed to Pareto efficiency. And what he says is, let me just give you the quote. He says, Pareto defines an improvement as a change that benefits someone and injures nobody. Okay. By the way, Murray Rothbard has pointed out that when that's taken very strictly, it's only true of market transactions, of voluntary transactions. Anything the government does will benefit, even though it benefits many people, will hurt at least one person, if the one person is a taxpayer, for example. And Mises uses the example of a hospital. Even if the government builds a hospital, okay, it isn't unambiguous, doesn't unambiguously increase economic welfare for everyone, though Mises doesn't use the term economic welfare, because the taxpayers are certainly worse off. So really, Pareto efficiency, when it's combined with Murray Rothbard's construct of demonstrated preference, shows that every market transaction that's voluntarily undertaken represents a net gain to society. And that's without having to compare utilities, without having to make any ethical judgments. Because it leaves at least two people better off and no one worse off. Demonstrably so. Okay. So let me go on. Pareto defined an improvement as a change that benefits someone and injures nobody. A situation is Pareto efficient if no further Pareto improvements are possible. This approach avoids the problem of trading off gains to one person against losses to another. So he is admitting that it's at least avoids this problem that we talked about of comparing interpersonally utility. Okay. And he points out that, let me just explain or give an example of Pareto improvement. Let's say you have an abolition of tariff on automobiles, okay, and it benefits the large majority of American consumers and workers, which it would in fact do by causing a fall in the price of autos. But it would hurt a small group of people in the population, those being the suppliers of the auto industries, the workers in the auto industry, the stockholders, and so on. Okay, but so in Pareto's sense, abolishing the tariff is not an improvement, but in Marshall's sense, it is, because you can add up dollars and find out that the dollar gains and lower prices is much higher to consumers than the dollar losses are to the producers. Okay. He then also talks about a potential Pareto improvement. The people who support Pareto efficiency often say, well, okay, that's true, but let's look at the following possibility. Let's say I gain $10 in this change, abolishing this tariff, and you who work in the auto industry lose $8, okay? That's the Pareto efficiency, because I can pay you $9 and make you better off, and I can still retain $1 and be better off. So we're both better off. So if the gains exceed the losses in dollar terms, according to the Pareto people, this is called the Hicks-Kaldor criterion for two economists that sort of try to adjust this, then society is better off. So in other words, if I can compensate you, if the winners on this side of the room gain so much that they can compensate the losers on this side, and I don't mean losers in sort of a personal sense, the losers on this side of the room, and still be better off themselves, retain some of the gain, then whole society is better off. But Friedman rightly points out that this can never happen, because you don't know who the losers are and by how much they lose, and it's very difficult to tell, how much, who the exact gainers are. Okay, so and if you ask people, of course they're going to lie about it. Okay, it's losers in particular, it's in their interest to lie. Okay, so what he says is that this is why we use Marshal efficiency and improvements instead of Pareto efficiency. He says even though Marshal improvements are in some sense intuitive, that is, yes, we cannot really compare dollars worth of satisfaction between people, but intuitively we know that if somebody gains $10, a poor person, a rich person loses $12. Well, society in some sense is better off. Or if there's a great gain to a big group of people and a small loss to a small group, well then society is better off. But that is not the conclusion from rational analysis. That's just this ridiculous intuitive feeling which should have no place in economics. But he does try to make one argument. He says, you know what? He says, let's say there's always changes going on in society, so they all average out. So A might be a loser or gainer in case one. He might gain $3 from one government policy, and B might lose $2, okay? But the next government policy, A may lose $4 and B may gain $6. And this is always going on, and in a large society where there's changes, all of it evens out. But again, that's not precise, it's not rational. And so I don't think he makes his case. Okay. Now, there's a very interesting... let me point something else out. According for Austrian economists, even let's just take a person C. At one time, T1, he gains $10, okay? And, well, let's say he loses $10, okay, by one government program. Another government program comes in at time T2, and he gains $1 million, okay? These happen at different times. You can't even say that he's overall better off, okay? If it happened at the same time, okay, in T1, well then he would say, yeah, oh sure, I'd rather have these two programs together because I gain a total of, almost $1 million. But if this happens a year later, you can't compare these things. He is not in a choice situation. He can't choose between these things. So you can't even say that this person, you can't even say in the case of an individual that person is better off over time because at one point he gained $1 million and at another point he had lost 10. Okay. Now, what I want to mention is a very interesting example that Friedman uses. Regarding Marshal Improvements. He talks about a pill that would extend life. See how many years he uses here. He says, that doubles life expectancy. So someone has a pill that will double life expectancy. There's A and there's B. So if A has the pill, okay, it's so valuable to A that B can't purchase it, okay? On the other hand, though, if B has the pill, it's so valuable to B that A can't purchase it, okay? So, in other words, there's no way to assess how much each values the pill that doubles life expectancy. If there was, if this guy valued it $1 million, and this guy valued it at 500,000, well, then you would give it to this guy. You'd take it away from B and give it to A because that would increase social welfare. But Friedman's saying in those cases where there are goods that have such a high value that to the individual who possesses it, no other individual could purchase it, then there's no way to compute a dollar value. So he's saying that might be one problem for Pareto, for Marshal efficiency. Okay, but he says most of the time you don't get that because most of the changes result in small losses and gains to individuals. Okay, so you can still use the Pareto efficiency. For example, he says it doesn't matter if we have tariffs in the beginning or we don't have tariffs. Okay, the policy that is guarantees improvement, or the policy that is optimal, is the policy of no tariffs. Because whether you impose them, if you impose them, you hurt the person, a very small group of people, by very little, and you benefit a large group of people by a great amount. Okay, so he says, but for the most part, Marshal efficiency is the proper criterion. Okay, and he goes on to say, but the Pareto approach, anyway, the Pareto approach cannot decide who should get the pill or whether the tariff should be abolished. Because with the Pareto approach, remember, you need unanimity. Even if one person's hurt, then you can't abolish the tariff. So he says only the Marshal approach can give you the answer. But he's, of course, left out the Austrian approach, Rothbard's approach. Mises Rothbard, which is a property rights approach. Okay. Not only is it a property rights approach, it's an approach that is consistent with monetary calculation, which allows the market economy to operate efficiently to serve consumer wants. So let's take the pill example. If A has the pill, well then by the property rights approach, if he's the first one to discover it, even if B somehow values it more, it's A's pill. Okay? And the reason being that not only property rights, but secure property rights leads to this A then continuing to research and discover and find a better and lower cost technology for marketing the pill. If you take it away because somebody else values it more, B values it more somehow, well then A has no incentive to introduce the pill for mass consumption. Right? So the property rights approach gives you unambiguous answers. It doesn't involve a comparison of interpersonal comparison of utility between A and B, and it's also consistent with the market economy, which needs free market prices and costs. So B wants it, he has to purchase it. And the second point I want to make is the tariff question. It gives an absolute answer to the tariff question, and that is that tariffs are a violation of property rights. They're giving a small group of people a monopoly price, the ability to set a monopoly price for domestic producers, and in doing so, they're forcibly changing the demand curve for automobiles. Okay? They're reducing the number of substitutes that American consumers have available to them at low prices. So they're making Americans, they're forcing their demand curve to become steeper and make them more willing to pay higher prices for American cars because there are no foreign substitutes. So it's violating property rights and it's distorting monetary calculation. It's in the sense that it's causing higher profits than there should be in the car industry domestically and causing greater production of cars here in the U.S. where production isn't inefficient. Okay? So there is an unambiguous answer given by the property rights approach. Okay. And then he says that the only Friedman says the only alternative to his, Marshal efficiency, admitting that it's pretty, bad and inadequate, is intuitionism. Okay, meaning that I'll just read you the quote. Yeah, here it comes. He says, it is much harder to propose a better criterion. Well, we saw it's not. This is a criterion that has been already proposed. And he doesn't deal with. The most popular alternative seems to be intuition. One thinks about a change and decides whether it is on the whole good or bad. In order to do that right, one must take account of the consequences for everyone affected. Hundreds, thousands, in some cases hundreds of millions of people. But nobody I know is mentally equipped to intuit the lives of hundreds of different people. Nor do we come equipped with knowledge of what effect a particular change will have on each of them. Well, didn't we recall him at the beginning talking about intuition? In fact, I read the quote. He said, economic improvement is intended as a workable approximation of our intuitions about what changes are on net good or bad. So he's doing the same thing. He's saying, well, my intuition tells me that a poor man values a dollar less than more than a rich man. Or my intuition tells me that somehow if a lot of people gain a lot of money and some people lose a little money, well, that's good for society. But that's just intuition. That's not reason. He's doing the exact same thing he's criticizing others for. Okay. Now let me talk about Steve Landesberg, who I said is more subtle and smarter, and believes that there should be some sort of moral philosophy. So for Friedman, he's never talked about property rights in any of this, or any other ethical issue. He's tried to come up with some economic hocus pocus, by adding people's utilities in terms of money to get around it. All right. Landis, on the other hand, seems to understand that you can't do that, at least initially. Okay, so let me just read what he says. Oh, yeah. Here's what he says. He says, here's an example. He says, suppose Jack and Jill draw equal amounts of water from a community well. Jack's income is $10,000, of which he is taxed 10% or $1,000, so Jack pays $1,000 to support the well. Jill's income is $100,000, of which she is taxed 5% or $5,000 to support the well. So she pays 5 times as much. Her income is 10 times as much as Jack's, but she pays 5 times as much to support the well. Okay? She's paying a lower tax rate, but the absolute amount is greater. He goes on to say, in which direction is that tax policy unfair? Okay? In other words, should Jill pay the same proportion of her income as Jack Or should Jack pay a higher proportion of his income to equal the amount of money that Jill is paying, which she's paying 5 times as much? So he was arguing with a woman over dinner here, and he says, my companion's straightforward response was that she had never thought about the issue in those terms before and was unsure of her answer. I have no problem with that, meaning Landsberg. I have thought about the issue in those terms quite a bit and am still unsure of my own answer. That's why I hesitate to pronounce judgment on the fairness of tax policy. If I can't tell what's fair in a world with 2 people and one well, meaning one good, how can I tell what's fair in a country with 250 million people and tens of thousands of government services? That's good. If he'd shut his mouth, shut up, and not in the rest of the chapter, I would have no problem with that. Okay? He should then go on and say, I have to hand this off to moral philosophy, to the ethics of social ethics. Okay? But he doesn't say that. Okay? So he goes on to say, with never thought to what fairness might consist of in the abstract, my companion was prepared to pass a judgment on specific instances, confident that if she couldn't define it, she could at least recognize it when she saw it. Meaning, again, she was appealing to her own intuition. And so what he goes on to say is what she lacked was a moral philosophy. There are many moral philosophies to choose among, and I believe, and here we go, I believe that economic reasoning is the most powerful tool we have for evaluating their merits. Okay? So, in his case, he goes through a number of instances in which he talks about some people want to pursue the greatest good for the unhappiest person. Okay, some philosophers, and he points out that what about people that what about if the unhappiest person, him or herself, prefers to live in a world where the moral criterion did not involve the welfare of the least happy person? So he's saying those sorts of things get you into contradictions. What if I'm the least happy person, but I don't want people to be solicitous of me? I don't want to live in that type of a world. So also he says, what if we try to maximize the sum of human happiness? Okay, and find out that we can increase the sum by agreeing not to maximize the sum of human happiness. All right, so you have all these so-called paradoxes. So what he's doing, in effect, is he's trying to get away from moral philosophy. After saying you need it, he's saying, well, it involves you in all these paradoxes. But he never talks about property rights as a solution to any of this. He talks about all these crazy schemes from John Rawls and so on. So he says on page 59 here, he makes a statement about moral philosophy. Oh, no, actually, I want to show you what he winds up with, because we're running out of time here. On a windy day in New Orleans, the dollar bill I was holding got away from me. As it headed for a sewer and oblivion, I started to grab for it. David Friedman, author of the previous book I was talking about, my companion, my fellow economist, and temporarily the guardian of my soul, stayed my hand. I had just been arguing economic efficiency as an appropriate guide to personal conduct. By that standard, David's interference saved me from thoughtlessly committing an immoral act. Now, why would this act be immoral according to the standard of economic efficiency? I mean, these guys are so crazy. Okay, so the dollar bill gets lost, right? So the dollar bill's lost. He's going to go. He knows where it is. No one else knows where it is. He's going to stick his hand in the store and get it back. He can reach it. All right. Friedman doesn't want him to go for it. The reason is it's going to take him 3 cents of effort to reach for it. So he's only going to gain 97 cents back. Okay. Right? So he's going to improve society by, once it's been in the sewer, he's going to improve society by only 97 cents, his own welfare. However, if he leaves it in the sewer and no one ever sees it, what happens to prices? There's less money in the economy. There's a deflation of prices. So there's full $1 worth of goods left for other people to purchase that he can't purchase. So if he leaves it in the sewer, he adds $1 to social welfare. I mean, he's serious. So, he goes on to say, he runs his life like this. He says something like, if he has an unkempt, he says, if my unkempt lawn, if he doesn't do his lawn weekly, it could cause my neighbors $20 worth of grief. But if it costs him $30 to cut the lawn weekly, to have someone come and cut the lawn, well then he's not going to cut the lawn because it would be immoral, right? Because he's only he's losing $10 worth of value in society. That is $10 of his. Okay, he's paying more to cut the lawn than it's worth to his neighbor. Okay, even if, let's say he's indifferent towards the lawn being cut. On the other hand, if the neighbor has $50 of disutility or dissatisfaction, then he will pay $30 to have the lawn cut. So this is what, after this, saying that only moral philosophy can solve these problems, he comes up with this, what could you call it? I mean, moronic criterion to determine how we should act in our everyday lives. He then goes on to say, however, that in certain big situations, he would not use this criterion. Let's see, so on page 71, let me see, here. He faces this moral dilemma. Here's the moral dilemma. This led me to formulate the following moral dilemma. Suppose that getting to Boston and back is worth $300 to you. Okay? Here's my eraser. Right, so you want to go to Boston and come back, and it's round trip ticket. So it's worth $300. Oh, you pay up $300 for the round trip ticket. All right. Okay, so that's Boston round trip. All right, so it costs the airline $200 to provide you that transportation. So the marginal cost to the airline to let you on the plane is $200. Okay. But because of some extraordinary degree of monopoly power, the airline charges $1,000 for the ticket. So the airline is going to charge you $1,000 because it has monopoly power. He says, should you fly? If you care only about efficiency, then you certainly should. If you fly, you are worse off by $700. Okay. You lose $700. Right? Because it's only worth $300 to you. Okay. While the owners of the airline are better off by $800. Right? They gain $800. Okay. The difference between what they collect and the cost of flying. There's a net gain of $100, and the efficiency criterion pronounces the trip a good thing. Yet I am sure that I would not buy the ticket. They're very good. And I'm equally sure that I would lose no sleep over it. I am sure that I would reach the same conclusion no matter how much the airline owner stood to gain or how little I stood to lose. So while I still believe that efficiency is usually the right general guide to government policy and often the right general guide to personal behavior, I mean, it's unbelievable. I now think that we need a much subtler criterion before we can really know what it means to be good. I believe there are times when I ought to try to behave efficiently and other times when I need not. I just haven't figured out the rules for knowing which times are which. Well, let me know when you do, and I'll ignore them. Well, that's it. I mean, that's, this is what high-powered mainstream economists, because, he's done work in, technical economics, he doesn't just write these books, it's called economism, okay, where they're abusing economics and trying to use it as a substitute for moral philosophy. In the airline case, of course I wouldn't fly. Not only that, I would try to destroy the airline monopoly because it's a violation of property rights. Okay? So, I'll stop there because it's 2:30, right? Yeah. Thank you.